Welcome to WonderPod. WonderPod is the official podcast of WonderFest, Ireland's first online children's book festival. I'm your host, Conor Braden. In this podcast, we'll be discussing everything there is to talk about with children's books. I'll be talking with Ireland's top writers, illustrators, publishers, agents, and more. You can find out more about WonderFest by heading to wonderfest.ie. Now, on with the show. Whale, whale, whale. What have we here? That's right, not one, but two episodes of WonderPod this week, folks. Another episode came out today as well, where I interviewed Matthew Parkinson, editor at Little Island Books. But if you didn't notice by the title, this episode is all about agents. My guest for this episode is the wonderful Polly Nolan. After almost 20 years commissioning and editing children's books at some of the UK's top publishing houses, Polly Nolan moved to agenting in 2013 and quickly built a talented and successful list of clients. In 2020, she started her own agency and consultancy, PaperCuts Limited, which represents authors writing for children from 5 to YA, as well as offering advice to anyone needing help with their work. Always on the lookout for a good story, arrestingly told, of course, Polly has a particular love of middle grade, especially middle grade, that makes people laugh. So, I'll remind you to maybe re-listen to last week's episode to figure out what middle grade particularly entails. Polly and I talk about all things to do with agents in the world of children's literature, and considering her vast knowledge from her years in the publishing world, she talks through the exact process books typically go through, from the author saying, "I'm done," which, you're not done, to the author submitting, the acquisition process, editing, publishing, and more. Seeing as Polly is particularly interested in middle grade, maybe you could check out our masterclass with Eve McDonnell on writing fantasy and time travel novels for children and teens. I have personally singled this one out for myself to attend, so if you're interested, give it a go and say hi if you see me. As always, head over to wonderfest.ie to buy your tickets. Anyway, let's hear from Polly now, shall we? Hello, Polly, and welcome to WonderPod. Thanks so much for coming on. How are you getting on?
I'm very well, thank you for having me, Conor. I'm delighted to be here.
Not at all. It's great, and your first podcast as well. So it's,
exactly, yes.
Hopefully, it'll be a pleasant experience. I've heard of negative ones you've had. We might talk about that again. My first question is maybe just could you give us a little background of how you got started in well, not in children's writing, but in writing and the publishing industry in general.
Yes, so I'm from Galway originally, and I had got my degree in English from UCG as it was back in the day, NUIG as it is now, and I always knew I wanted to be an editor, and I tried to get into publishing in Ireland, and I just couldn't. It was a fairly closed industry then. So I headed off to London with my English Lit degree in my back pocket, and my aspirations of working only on the Faber adult literary list. I had no intention at all of going into children's. And when I got to London, I had to get a job straight away, and I got one in a children's bookshop by sheer chance and luck. And through that, it kind of opened my eyes to the wealth of children's literature and children's books. But I also got to know the sales reps who came in from the various publishing houses. And I started to ask them, if they heard of any jobs coming up, could they let me know? And the first one that came up was as an assistant in the children's rights department of a big publishing house. And this publishing house also had an adult division. It wasn't Faber, but it still had a literary division. And I thought, well, I'll apply for the children's job, and if I get it, it's at least a foot in the door.
Foot in the door, yeah.
Yeah, and I got the children's job, the job in the children's section, and within 6 weeks, I just knew I absolutely loved working here. I loved what they were doing. I loved the people. I just felt really at home, and I kind of just steadily, I moved across as soon as I could. I moved from the rights side of things, which is selling translation rights and books. It wasn't really something that appealed to me, but I moved as soon as I could into a very junior editing side and worked my way up and kind of never looked back. And the one advantage of working in the rights department like that was it gave me a really clear grounding on picture books and novelty books and fiction and how they work and the importance of foreign rights deals and things like that and how a book is made. So it was great.
Yeah, and I think that things like that, because I've spoken to other guests as well about how they got started in this kind of industry, and it seems that a lot of people say even if you don't get the job you're aiming for, like whether it even be writing or illustrating or working within a publishing house or as an agent, like any little foot in the door in the industry is really beneficial, because like you just said, then you really get to know the industry from the inside anyway.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to working towards what you actually want to do, you know, you have a little bit of an advantage then.
Yeah, exactly. And also one of the things I have found throughout my career, both as a publisher and as an agent, is the level of support amongst your colleagues, even what you might call rival agents or rival publishing houses. It's just, particularly in children's books, it's a really supportive environment. And I think anyone writing children's books or publishing children's books, I hope they find the same thing. It's not cutthroat at all. I mean, there's a little bit of jealousy, but, you know, by and large, people only want people to succeed. It's a very positive atmosphere in which to work. So
I think as well, my listeners will find that familiar, because I can't recall who said it, but somebody in an earlier episode already said that one of the best things of particularly the Irish children's author kind of sphere is it is a community, and people are very supportive, like you just said. Like, because I think, and I said it to them as well, every author is a reader first anyway, and the same with a publisher, same with an agent. So there can never be too many books. You're never, like, no one person's going to write more than they've read. So there's never going to be enough books. Keep writing, everybody.
No, it's very true. And also because it's not an easy thing to be a writer, and particularly to be a published writer. And everybody, even the very best writers, the most famous, the people you just dream of being, they've all had their knockbacks, they've all had their rejections, you know, and they completely understand it. So it's it's a very, as I say, once I got into children's, I never looked back. My dream of working on the literary list completely fell by the wayside.
Well, do you know what's for you won't pass you, isn't that what they say?
Exactly.
So Polly, could you tell me then, you've, like you said, you've worked with a publishing house, but now you're working as an agent. So maybe could you explain, because like I feel like everyone kind of thinks they know what an agent is, but could you actually explain the role of an agent when it comes to the author agent publisher relationship?
Yeah, I can certainly try. It's actually not a terribly easy one to define, and I get asked quite a lot. When I was an editor, when I was commissioning from agents, an agent was a necessary evil. So they sent me manuscripts to read and stuff, but then I had to negotiate, really battle with them over contract and stuff. And I think the simplest way of summing it up is that an agent is like a business manager. So as an author, you want to concentrate on the creative stuff. You don't want to be thinking about what royalty you're being paid for a French edition of a book, sort of a thing. So your agent does all of that for you, but also agents are, so that's putting it at its most crudely. So if I have a client, I work with them on their manuscript. I am also then talking to editors regularly. I'm talking to editors two or three different editors a week. I'm asking what they're looking for. I'm getting a sense of their lists. I know their tastes and stuff like that. So that if a client of mine has a manuscript, I'm always thinking which editors are going to like this, which editors I shouldn't send it to. And so I'm being quite strategic in trying to place their manuscript with a publisher.
If I can stop you there, you said something very interesting. Which editors to not send it to, because I think that's really telling of how like I'm here, I'm the host, but I'm really the kind of the stand-in of the aspiring children's author, right? So the second I heard that, I was like, oh, so you don't just send it to every editor, every publishing house. You do have to think strategically, don't you?
Yeah, you do, because there's just so much stuff being written by people. And also there's absolutely no point in me sending, if I know an editor hates, say for example, animal stories, it's a waste of my time and the author's time and the editor's time for me to send an animal story to them. So I'm doing that, and then once I hopefully get an offer in for the book, none of the big UK publishers are ever really going to try and, you know, take the Michael out of an author, and you will always get a fairly basic contract that's pretty fair. But as an agent, I'm always working to improve that and to make sure that, you know, it's not just about the advanced level, it's about royalties, it's about the discount at which books can be sold to shops, it's about what the definition of a book that's in print is. I'm kind of managing all of that, just trying to get the very best deal for the author. And then I think the other thing that's a big unknown to authors who aren't yet published, and I don't want to put people off, but actually completely understandably, getting that first book deal, getting your first book published is the dream scenario, and people don't see beyond that. And actually being an author can be quite a lonely thing. So your first book may not do very well, or it might do brilliantly, but you've had 5 years to write it, and suddenly you have to write a second book within 10 months whilst doing publicity. And your agent is always going to be there by your side, helping you to navigate those waters, helping you to work on the second book before it goes to an editor. If, for example, things like, and this happens surprisingly often, the editor sends you the cover visual, the kind of layout for the cover that they'd like to put on your book, and you as the author hate it. That can be really scary and demoralizing and intimidating. And again, an agent is there to just navigate that and help you. And it sounds a bit twee, I don't really like to say it, but we're kind of there as a friend by your side. And so it's one of the things I think is very important to people listening to this who are still looking for agents, is that don't necessarily rush to sign with the first agent who offers you representation. It's really important that you speak to them, you talk to them about your work, that you really get a sense as an author that you can work with that person long term. Don't get bedazzled or kind of just grab onto the first person to offer you representation. It's a hard graft for writers, and you need to be with someone you trust and that you can speak to, and that you feel you can ring them up, that you're not disturbing them, that they are there to help you. So
that's a really good point, because you kind of, like you said it already with the editor, that you don't want to send an animal story to the editor and in the same line, you don't want to just say yes to an agent and then find out, well, actually this agent has spread themselves too thin and won't be able to give you and your manuscripts the time that you and your manuscripts need. So you do have to think. And I do think there is a tendency among the aspiring authors that as soon as there's a whiff of positivity, they latch onto it, because it's such a big deal.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. I think the other thing I should make a really vital point, actually, which is that in Ireland you are really blessed as authors, because I think all of the publishing houses will still accept entries from you, just posting them into the publishing house. In the UK, for the last 20 years, it's been a closed door. You just could not, as an author, have got your manuscript in front of an editor by putting it in the post or emailing it. You needed an agent for sure to do that. Increasingly in the UK, thankfully, they are sort of having periods of time where they're open to anybody who wants to send in their work. So definitely take advantage of that. And if you do go ahead without an agent, says me putting myself out of a job here, there are some really good resources online. So in the UK, there's the Society of Authors, and you pay a subscription to them, but they are brilliant at helping you negotiate a contract if you need that sort of help. They won't negotiate it for you, but they will give you advice that you have to pay for. But they are, so, there are lots of people who manage to publish successfully without an agent. Obviously, I think agents are important, but they're not for everybody. So
there was one thing on my other podcast, Story of a Storyteller, I spoke with actually I had mentioned her to you before I hit record, a Chinese American author, Xian Julie Wang is her name, and we were talking about it, and she brought up such a good point. She said that the issue is that authors are essentially, how we like to think of ourselves anyway, are artists, but the publishing side of it is a business, and exactly. Not necessarily, like, artists aren't necessarily good business people. Not saying there aren't authors out there, but I think that's basically what you're saying, that the agent is there to translate things for the author and to fight their corner, and to read the fine print of a contract and say, actually, this might nip you in the butt later on. Maybe let's see if we can get that out. Or things like that.
And also, you don't necessarily want to just sign all of your rights over to a publisher. If a publisher is not very good at exploiting film rights or US rights or television, you don't want them to have those rights. You're better to have those rights and do nothing with them than to let the publisher have them and not do anything with them. So it's that sort of thing we can help with. But yeah, as I said at the beginning, the really kind of simple way of putting it is that the agent is the business manager while the author does the creative stuff. You want to get on and write and read and research your stories. You don't want to be reading the nitty-gritty of a contract.
Yeah. And now you also have some vital experience as well on the other side of the coin as a publisher. Maybe now, this is going to sound a bit stupid of me, and that's okay. I'm a primary teacher. I'm used to acting stupid to get the point across. But like obviously the publisher is the company that will print the book, will distribute it, and all that kind of thing. But
Yeah.
what are some of the kind of less obvious roles of a publisher that the aspiring author might not be aware of?
Well, probably publishers will be throwing things at whatever they're listening to this to on by the time I answer this. It's very interesting for me because when I was a publisher, I thought agents, as I say, were kind of a necessary evil, and it's only when you become an agent you really fully appreciate, the services they offer and how important they are to authors by and large. Publishers really do everything. So they are, if you publish a book yourself, it's very hard for you to get that book into Waterstones or into Eason's, so they have these big distribution networks set up, and they can distribute, they can get your book in. They pay people to get your book into places that you just can't, especially if you're working full-time and writing on the side. You can't be out on the road, going and knocking on doors of just big as saying, can you take my book for me? They also have publicity and marketing departments that are very big and very experienced. They have reach into, literary festivals and things like that. So in the UK, for instance, everybody is desperate to get into the Edinburgh Literary Festival or Hay Literary Festival. And actually, it's practically impossible for the man on the street or the author on the street to do that. It's hard for a publisher to get into it, but they have a much better chance of it than. And as I say, the ones, not all of them are the same, but the ones who are, they have a sister company in the US are really good at exploiting US rights and getting good US deals as well. The smaller independent publishers may not be. One of the things I find very interesting as an agent, because as a publisher, you work only in your publishing house and you might shift to another publishing house, but your limit of publishing houses is fairly limited, whereas with an agent, you're dealing with all publishing houses. And I would say they all have strengths and weaknesses. But I would, for some people going down a non-traditional route, publishing an ebook or self-publishing is a very good and successful thing. But if you're one of 40,000 people that week self-publishing their book, how do you get your book noticed in that white noise? With a publisher, they're only going to publish stuff that they have a plan. Because again, it's that strategic thing. They know when they're publishing it, they know why they're publishing it, they know how they're publishing it, and they put the finance and the expertise behind it.
I think that's the thing. A lot of people feel that the publishing houses, well, not a lot of people, but I do know there are people out there who think, oh, they just do the edit and they just design the book. And I was like, or the book cover. And well, no, there's a lot more behind it. Having said that, you mentioned that publishing houses have marketing departments and all that kind of thing. That doesn't mean they do every little bit of marketing. Like the author, you said it earlier, even the author is also doing, like, you get your first book deal, then you're expected to write the next book in 10 months while also doing publicity stuff. So it's a team effort. And I think that's the thing with a publishing house is it is a team effort. You have the editor from the publishing house, you might have an agent, there's yourself, like everyone wants the book to do as best it can.
Exactly. And as I say to my clients all the time, I might have a client with one particular publisher and they are talking to another client of mine that's with another publisher, and they will say to me, but they got this marketing, they got this publicity. And I say, all these publishing houses are publishing an awful lot of stuff, and I have never once met a person in publicity and marketing who did not work their socks off. They are so committed. But in my experience, they're also overstretched. Yeah. So everything an author can do for themselves, they should be doing as well. And a lot of the publishing houses will give, if you ask them, they don't always volunteer, but they're very happy to give kind of training and support and that sort of thing. But again, your agent can be the negotiation. If you get your first publishing deal, you're not really sure what it's like correct to ask your publisher for, and it can be, if you're published by Penguin Random House or something, you can feel a bit intimidated and you could just have a sense of gratitude and you don't want to cause trouble or be a bad author. Just ring your agent. That's what your agent is there for. I'm perfectly happy to chase up something or say, why haven't you done this yet, or so yeah
no, that's, I think that's a fair point. You don't be starstruck.
Yeah.
Because that's basically what we're saying, isn't it? With
Yeah.
like if it's one of the big five, just because it's one of the big five doesn't mean that you can say nothing. Like
Yeah,
you say
absolutely.
no if you're not feel comfortable or whatever.
Yeah.
Could you maybe take us through a typical? I was going to say a typical day, but I feel like you're in a type of industry where there isn't a typical day. So maybe tell us what a typical week might have in the role of an agent.
Well, there's before lockdown and after lockdown, of course.
True.
So. It's not, unfortunately, long boozy lunches. I believe it used to be like that back in the day, but sadly it isn't like that anymore.
No.
Um,
Long boozy Zoom calls instead, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Gin in a water glass. There isn't a typical day at all. It's there are never enough hours in the day, that's for sure. I tend to structure my day by starting in the morning and spending an hour reading submissions that have come in, because they come in constantly, they never stop, and it's quite I find if you don't keep on top of them, they just run out of control. So that's what I tend to do. But I also find that actually, unless it's something really spectacularly good, an hour is enough, because you're reading so many different voices and stories and things like that. And whenever you're reading anything, you're kind of running a mental thing about, what is this book? Where does it sit in the market? Is there a market for it? Which editors might like it? You know, you're weighing up a whole load of things. So it's quite intense work, but I can only really do it properly for an hour a day. If I look at this morning, for instance, I've just come back from a week off, and I've had about 5 or 6 clients send me their manuscripts, all of which I promised so once I've come back from my holiday, I'll be back to you. So I've started reading one of those, and it needs quite a lot of work. So I've been collecting my thoughts a bit on that. I have been negotiating 2 separate contracts for people. I've had a call with an author about an idea they have. And then I would normally also, I don't today because I'm speaking here, but I would also probably have a call or an email exchange with an editor. I might just ring and say, or I might just email to say, you know, can we have a chat? I haven't spoken to you a bit. Or I might email and say, are you looking for X, Y, and Z at the moment? A really important part of the job of an agent, I find, is that actually, and it's throughout publishing, it's exactly as an author with their editor as well. Channels of communication, keeping them open. So I talk regularly to editors, and back in the day when we could travel and we could go in, offices were open and stuff, I would go in. I wasn't living in London when I lived in the UK, I was living in Oxford, but I would go to London for 1 or 2 days a week, and those days I would spend just going around seeing editors and just asking them what they're looking for, just also kind of just getting the industry gossip and
keeping your ground and
exactly.
keeping connected. Yeah. Exactly. Which I think, as you've already said in many different ways, like that's vital for an agent, because that's your role then with the author, is keeping them in the know and helping them navigate it. So you kind of do have to know a bit of everything. Yeah,
exactly. And then I should be on social media way more than I'm on social media, but I'm so easily distracted by it. I tend to not be on it as much as I should, but I just go down rabbit holes on that.
On social media, actually, and it's not a question I've prepared, but I feel like you've answered this many times. You'll probably answer it many times again. What is the importance that agents and publishers place on an author's following on social media, if they have one or not? Maybe with a debut author, it's a bit different, but if it's somebody that's going to a different publisher with something, does a publishing house or an agent look and go, oh, this guy has 10,000 followers on Twitter and this many on Instagram? Does that ever weigh at all?
It all helps. What I would say is, if you're not on Twitter and you don't have a website, don't panic. Yeah. If you're thinking of submitting, I would start getting onto Twitter, and you don't need to be tweeting, just follow. There's loads of whatever area of the market, whether it's adult or children's or crime thrillers or just general, just follow people and retweet stuff. But yeah, I think you do need some sort of social media presence. If you have a social media following of 10,000 or a YouTube channel or whatever, publishers love it. So there's no harm in that at all. But don't panic if you don't have it. It's, you know, but I would get on there before we start submitting.
So it's more of a feather in the cap than an actual, like it's something that's a nice extra, but it's not something that's necessary when a publisher is deciding. would you say?
Well, people will be aware, and again, I'm talking particularly in the UK market and the US one, really, I guess, of the number of celebrities who get book deals with no writing experience whatsoever. And I have a bit of an issue with that, but I think that's a talk for another day. But so if you have a platform, if you have YouTube, if you are a YouTube influencer, publishers will bite your arm off that. I would always, when I am sending a manuscript to an editor, I will always mention if they have a good presence on social media, but I won't mention it if they don't. The thing is, if a publisher is, if an editor is, if an editor is interested in manuscript, they're going to ring me up. They going to want to know loads about the author and, you know, what they do and what else they're writing. And, you know, they will also, before they've rung me, they will very often have looked them up on social media. So I think I would definitely encourage it, but I wouldn't panic if you don't have 10,000 followers on Twitter, if that helps.
Yeah, no, that definitely will help a lot of the listeners, I am sure. So where do you, because obviously I can't say where do agents and publishers, because you're only one. But where do you find your authors? Is it purely through authors that submit to you, or do you, like you mentioned about keeping your ear to the ground, do you ever stumble across writers in any other ways?
Yes, you stumble across them in all sorts of ways. It's amazing actually how many people are writing books, and when you say you're an agent, then they'll tell you that they're writing a book. My favorite story about that is, which didn't happen to me at all, is there is an agent who has got a very, very brilliant, I mean, I love her as my client, but she's a bestseller and she's an award winner and all of that. And I asked that agent where she met her, and she told me that she'd met her at a literary festival in the UK. And I was a bit surprised that she'd met her at this particular literary festival. And she said, and I said, oh, did she do a workshop with you or something? And the agent said, no. She said, I was there. She'd gone as a volunteer. She was volunteering there. And she said, the agent said, and I'd gone to give some one-to-one feedback on people's manuscripts. And she said, we just happened at the same time to be outside having a cigarette together. And we just got chatting. And she told me that she was writing a book. And I said, that sounds quite interesting. Will you send it to me? And when I heard, and the rest is history. And when I heard that, I thought, I'm going to take up smoking, I think. But you get them through word of mouth. You get them through, some of my clients have recommended their friends who are writing books to send me stuff. I've signed a couple of people that way. Just in my inbox, actually, before I started talking to you, I saw an editor. I saw someone has sent me a query that an editor had said they're looking for an agent, and an editor had suggested that they get into contact with me because they thought we might get on quite well together. So they come. So
it can go the other way as well. Yeah. Okay. All right. So it really is, from the author's point of view, it really is about, you know, talking to people and not just submitting, but, you know, being active, talking to people, going to literary festivals, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And I think the thing to remember, because it can seem a really intimidating environment to people on the outside of it in particular. Every single agent and every single editor and every single publisher is looking for really good stuff to sell. And your stuff, you don't underestimate people get published. We get loads, and yes, we reject loads, but we are actually looking to publish and acquire. That's what we're trying to do. So, you know, you have as good a chance as anybody else. And I think something that might give people hope, although it makes me feel very sad in a way when I hear it. I was talking to somebody once who'd been very good friends with Roald Dahl in a publishing house, and had done his marketing and stuff. And this person told me that Roald Dahl always felt as a failure because he'd only really made a success as a children's writer, and that every time he came to deliver a new manuscript, they practically had to wrestle it out of his hands because he was convinced it just wasn't good enough. It wasn't going to be as good as the previous one. He was crippled with self-doubt. And I think there is a man who gave such joy and still does to millions of people across the world, got so many people reading, got so many authors writing, you know, he inspired so many people, and yet he felt he wasn't good enough. So it's natural to feel like that, but you know, you can write a great novel and leave it sitting in your drawer. Nobody's going to come and look in your drawer and find it. You've got to just have the confidence to go out. And I think if you can remember, we are all looking for stuff to sign. We're always looking for new material and good books and good stories. So you have as much chance as anybody else. So get out there to literary festivals and talk to people, and don't be afraid to submit. And if you get a few knockbacks, that happens to absolutely every single author. Very few people get signed for their first book.
Yeah, I mean, famously, the first Harry Potter book was rejected like, it was 11 or 14 times or something, you know. And I mean, you know, can you imagine being the publisher who said no?
Well, it was kind of a badge of honor amongst editors of a certain generation in the UK that they turned it down.
So seeing as we're talking about how you find authors, let's flip it then onto the authors. How do authors successfully stand out? Now that's gonna sound, it sounds like a bit of a redundant question. It's write a good book and submit it, you know. But like, is it like, in what other ways can authors be heard? Because like you said, it seems like everyone's writing a book these days, which is a good thing. But you know, how can we as the aspiring authors be seen more easily?
In many ways, it's quite a simple thing when you're talking about submitting to agents. It's being professional. You know, it's running a spell check beforehand. I think something that's really vital to remember also is that you might spend 3 years writing your novel and polishing it before you send it in, but the first bit of writing an agent is going to read of yours is your submission email. And if you've made a hanes of that, that's the first impression I have of your writing. And I think, you know, you can run whole courses on how to write a submission email, but there's a little bit of me that always thinks you don't have to write ages. You don't have to write loads and loads in your submission email. You can keep it very short and just get us straight into your story. I think that's one thing, that whole thing of, you know, just treat your submission as you would your CV. So make sure your spelling is correct. Make sure you've got the name of the person correct. I think another thing for people who are submitting to agents, and it's a really irksome thing, and it seems so ridiculous of agents to do it, but all agents have a different submission criteria, and it really is worth your time making sure you're following the submission criteria for every agent. And the reason is, it's not that we're just being really difficult, but it's just that, you know, if I get 40 submissions a day, I am in a way looking for a way to get through them. And I've asked for people to send them to me in a certain way because that's the most efficient way for me to read them, but that's a completely different way from the way another agency will do it. And if I say, I don't say this at PaperCuts, I'm just taking it as an example, but if I say, you know, send the first 5 pages of your book, paste it into your email, and you send me an attachment, I'm probably not even going to bother reading the attachment, because my first impression of you is that you're not professional, that you couldn't even bother to have read the submission criteria, and you don't respect me enough as an agent to have done it. It's just, you know, I've asked for the first 5 pages because I can read them on my phone or whatever it happens to be. So it's a real pain in the neck, but to kind of go through each agent's submission criteria, but really you are starting off on a really strong foot if you follow the criteria, and then you get the agent's name correct and things like that. You know, I'm never ever going to reject a manuscript because somebody calls me Pauline instead of Polly. I've got a bit of an odd name, but it's that first impression, and you don't want me to be kind of a bit annoyed before I start reading your actual book.
You said something there that I think people should really pay attention to, is treat it like a job application. It is a job application, really, isn't it? And I'm even thinking back to, like, thankfully I'm in a permanent teaching position, but I'm even thinking back to when I was first looking for a teaching job. It used to be infuriating when one school would ask for it to be emailed, and one school would ask for 1 copy to be printed, and one school would ask for 3 copies with a self-addressed envelope to send back stuff, you know. And it's just, if you send a job application off and you don't give everything that person asks for, it's not going to be looked at properly.
You're just start on the wrong foot.
Exactly. Yeah. And you said something there that I said I was going to ask you about, you know, let's say like, because I've submitted to a few publishers myself, and I've submitted different books, and it is bizarre how one publisher wants the first 50 pages, and then the next one wants the first 3 chapters, which could be very long depending on the type of book. But let's say you're an author who is, after reading the submission guidelines very carefully, they've drafted a really good cover letter, they have a synopsis, and then it says, please submit the first 8 pages. And then when they get to the bottom of the 8th page of their manuscript, they see that the bottom of the 8th page cuts off a sentence. So
sentence even worse.
or something, and or let's say that there's only 2 lines left on the 9th page, and that finishes the chapter or something like that. Like, what would your advice be? And again, you're only one agent, so you can only speak your own choice. But in general, what would your advice be for what should an author do in that case?
Just be sensible about it. If it runs on to 8 pages and 4 lines, send 8 pages and 4 lines. If I like the first 8 pages, I'm not going to say, oh my God, I'm not signing that person because they sent me 4 extra lines. We're not like that. That's what I mean. We're looking for stories. Yeah. But if they ask for 8 pages as an attachment, don't send 25, pasted into the email. I also actually quite recently was doing some one-to-ones for an event in England, and I asked one of the people I was doing the one-to-ones with to send me the full manuscript. But for the one-to-ones, they would have been, I think they were to send us the first 10 pages. I can't quite remember what it was. And when I read her first 10 pages, I thought, my God, that ended up really well on right at the end of the 10th page. But when she sent me the full manuscript, I realized she'd edited the first 10 pages to make it a little better, of a stronger ending for just 10 pages. And I thought, actually, that was quite a clever thing to do, and I would never have known unless I'd called in the full manuscript. So there are ways around it. Do you need a big gap between your chapter opening and your first line? Can you close that gap and give yourself, pull your text up by 8 pages? But it's not, what we don't want is 80 pages if we've asked for 8, and we don't want 15 if we've asked for 8, but nobody's going to think, oh my God, they sent me 9.5. So again, just be sensible about it.
It's be sensible, and it's like you said, put your best foot forward as well. Like, I mean, if the bottom of the 8th page, I don't know why I picked 8, but if the bottom of the 8th page, we will. If the bottom of the 8th page does end on a bit of a kind of a wah moment, but the 9th page has a whopper that you really feel this is going to get Polly's attention, she's definitely going to want to read more, send that 9th page is basically what you're saying.
Exactly. Or cut out a paragraph halfway through. But actually, funny enough, you would be amazed by the number of people who often, I've never understood this, don't do this. People will say, dear Polly, you've asked the first 8 pages of my book, but my book doesn't really get going till page 25. I'm thinking, if you know your book doesn't get going to page 25, then cut the first 25 pages. Don't send me 8 pages and basically tell me they're pretty crap because the book doesn't get going till page. But actually, I mean, it's not like hundreds of people do that, but I would regularly, I get something like that. And again, that just makes me think, for crying out loud, I'm not immediately, that makes an author stand out, but not in a good way.
Yeah. And that's the other thing. I mean, if you say that, that might be your opinion. But so let's say I do that to you, and I send something and say, look, I sent you the first chapter, but if I'm honest, the 3rd chapter is really where it gets going. You're straight away, before you even read that, you're already thinking, well, this isn't going to be good. Yeah. And subconsciously, you don't, like, no matter how hard you try, you'll be reading it with looking for the flaws as opposed to looking for the positives. So never talk yourself down, which is very hard for Irish people.
I know, but also if your book doesn't get going for the first 25 pages, then go and edit your book and cut the first 25 pages, Yeah. There's a lovely story I've heard before, and I don't know whether it's true or not. I kind of hope it is true, but apparently when William Golding was sending out the Lord of the Flies to publishers, it went all around the houses, all around the publishing houses in London. It was turned down by everybody. And apparently it got to the desk of, I can't think what the guy who set up Faber was, Mr. Faber, I can't think of his Christian name. And he looked at this manuscript. It was back in the day when everything was sent around on paper. It wasn't electronic, obviously. And he looked at this manuscript and he realized that the first 50 pages were covered in pipe tobacco and cigarette stains and coffee and wine and everything. The first 50 pages were, and the page 51 onwards was pristine. So he totally ignored the first 50 pages and just started reading on page 51 and signed the book, and the rest is history. And
that's mad.
Yeah, I really hope it's a true story, because it's such a brilliant one. But it also speaks volumes about, if the first 50 pages of your book are rubbish, get rid of them. If you don't write to an agent and say the first 20 pages aren't very good, but you've asked for the first 5, so here they are. If they're not very good, cut them before you start submitting.
Yeah, really sound piece of advice. Polly, just I should have asked you this before, but I'm sure you're still able to speak on it. What then about the illustrators that are hopefully listening? How, like, it is a completely different ballgame, I'm very aware, and social media is actually, I would say, more important for illustrators in a way, because you need to get your art out there and everything. Do you deal with illustrators yourself? And if not, how can illustrators, is there any tips you would have for illustrators in general regards finding an agent?
I don't deal with illustrators because I just have no experience or background, so I'm not the best person to speak about it, but just on general kind of experience and what I know. There are lots of agencies who are bespoke illustration agencies, so obviously try all of those. There are lots of competitions, particularly for undergraduates studying art. A lot of the big UK publishing houses there's the Macmillan Children's Illustration Prize and there's the Hachette Children's Illustration Prize. So that's a very good way of getting your work seen by art directors and designers. Increasingly, there are a lot of agents who, I just personally don't represent illustrations, but there are a lot of agents who represent authors and illustrators. I was talking to one just this morning, actually. But I think the other thing I find increasingly is that publishers are looking on Instagram and places like that for illustrators, particularly underrepresented illustrators. So I've got a client who's doing a picture book with Penguin Random House, and they found the illustrator for that through Instagram because they were looking for a particular representation in the book. Yeah.
Even so, like, sorry, because the second when you started saying publishers do look on Instagram and stuff, for some reason my thoughts was just that'd be the smaller, more kind of, more niche kind of publishers. But Penguin Random House, like one of the big five, found in art. That's amazing. It's particularly for underrepresented illustrators. I think that's where they're looking.
But yeah, increasingly publishers are looking in all sorts of places for people and writers and staff and illustrators who aren't middle class and white and went to university, which is a brilliant thing. But it's a bit like the writing side of things. They are looking for new illustrators, but definitely, the prizes that are open to publishers and the agencies are always looking for new illustrators. I don't know if in Ireland, I don't know if there's an equivalent thing in Ireland, so I'm talking only about the UK market here, but in England, in the UK, there is a book called the Writers and Artists Yearbook.
Yes, I know it, yeah.
And it comes out yearly and it lists all of the agents in the UK and it lists what they represent and what they're looking for. So they have a section that's separate in that for illustrators agents. So that would be a very useful thing to people to have a look at as well.
Excellent, thanks for that tip, because it's something I've always known of and always seen on a shelf in certain bookshops, and I was like, someday I'll think of myself highly enough that I'll buy that.
Borrow it from a library.
Yeah, there you go.
Actually, also just have a look on publishers' websites, because sometimes, as I say, increasingly they are open to people coming to them without agents, or they have a month or 6 weeks where they're open to that, and so they do the same for illustration as well.
Well, I do know Culture Night is a big thing. I think is it I think it's O'Brien's. You might know better. They actually have an open house on Culture Night sometimes.
There you go. That's perfect. Yeah.
Things like that. I'm sure other publishers do similar things. It's just that's the one I know. But then again, COVID might have put a stop to that, like it has with everything else.
Yeah. The other thing actually with authors, and I would imagine it applies equally to illustrators, is I very often tell authors or suggest to authors who are looking for agents that if they find a writer that they really like or a book that's similar to theirs, they just go and find out who the author's agent is and try that, just find out what their submission criteria are and then approach them as well.
Of course, that's a good way to work backwards, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So there's a question there. I'm kind of looking for, just because it's a very complicated process, so don't panic when I ask it. Could you give us like the bullet points or the key stages of the journey of a book from the author finishing the manuscript, in their eyes finishing the manuscript, to publication day? And let's say this author does get an agent. So what are all the kind of the steps, and don't go too in depth, because that could be a whole series of podcast episodes.
It could be, so call me. And also I've got so much experience of both, the whole process from start to finish, so just interrupt me if I start going into deeply. So the author finishes their manuscript, and if they're in Ireland, they could just send directly to an Irish publisher, which, as I say, is a huge, I mean, that really is a blessing for Irish authors. If you're going via the agent route, obviously you send it off to an agent. So if I find it, if something comes into me that I think sounds promising, I will ask to see the full manuscript. And then if I'm thinking of signing that author as a client, I will call the author or email them. We'll just set up some kind of a conversation. And this ties back to the point I was making earlier, that don't just jump on the first agent who offers you representation. When I'm calling you or talking to you, that's your time to interview me and get a sense for me as well, whether you think we would work, whether we share the same vision.
Actually, sorry, there's one very important thing. Sorry to cut across you.
That's fine.
Because I think it's something that, again, because you're in the industry and because I've been exploring the industry for so long.
Yeah.
Publishers, like authors, don't pay publishers. I think that's something we should.
Yes, please do not pay a publisher. Please.
Or not publisher or agents. Like authors.
Run for the hills. An agent takes we take a commission, we take a cut, and again, the Society of Authors, for example, will tell you what the standard rates are for agents, so you'll know whether an agent is taking standard minus 15% of your income, and that's of your earnings, and that's absolutely industry standard. So yes, please don't go down the line of where you're paying somebody to publish your book. So I will, if I then sign the client, they sign an agreement with PaperCuts, my agency, and again, that's an industry standard thing, and it just lays out the terms so everybody knows where they stand. It's a very straightforward, simple thing. 9 times out of 10, actually I can't think of a single instance where this hasn't happened, I will work with the author to edit the manuscript. And one of the very important things I feel in my job as an agent is to work with you as an author to get that book good enough to get it through an acquisitions process in a publishing house, but not so that you're sick to death by the time an editor requires it, because without a shadow of a doubt, an editor will want to work on it as well. So anyway, so once myself and the author have worked on the book, and I think it's good enough to go out, and I will have been talking to editors, I will have just saying, I've got this thing coming, are you interested in seeing it? And I'm hoping it will come, I'll be sending it out to you in September. Then you have the most excruciating and horrible waiting time where it's completely out of your control. But agents feel exactly the same thing. The book is out, the agent loves the book, the author loves the book, and you're just waiting for it to come back. And you always, or unless it happens sometimes that you've got something where overnight 10 or editors are offering for it, which is very exciting, but also very stressful in its own way. But 9 times out of 10, I am then ringing people 2 or 3 weeks later, or emailing them saying, have you managed to read that book yet? I'd love to know your thoughts on that book, just chasing for a response. And then in the general scheme of things, you'll get that chasing will elicit a whole load of no's. But as I always say to people, whilst you only need 1 editor to like the book, you don't need 10 editors to like it. So, so if it's in-house with an editor who really likes it, they are then going to share it first with their editorial colleagues to say, I really like this book, what do you think? Am I mad in liking this book? And they will talk about where the book sits in the market, how the book sits already within the publisher's list, how they can make it stand out from everything else that's being published by the publisher that month, but by all the other publishers that month as well. They will have a very clear strategic plan. They will understand where it sits in the market. And then the commissioning editor will take that book to an acquisitions meeting. An acquisitions meeting happens in-house in a publishing house, and it's where the managing director is, the financial director is, the sales director is, the rights director is, all the big movers and shakers. It's an intimidating meeting. It can be a very intimidating meeting for an editor, because you go in there with a book you really want to acquire, that you have a vision for, but you've got to persuade all these other people who may not even have read the whole manuscript. They may only have read part of it. And assuming everybody is on board with it and likes it, and you have put forward a very clear strategy for where the book sits in the market and how you will publish it, it's an echo of that whole thing that you will hear as authors wanting to send your book out. What's the hook for your book? That what's the hook for your book kind of reverberates right through the acquisition system. And then that editor will get they'll get permission. Then they will agree that they're going to offer for the book, and they will discuss the advance level, and they will discuss the number of rights they want for that advance level. And then the editor has to do a whole load of really intricate and boring costings, including speaking from the sales director and the foreign rights directors about how many books they think that book will sell in each different channel.
Okay.
And they're all plugged into a spreadsheet, and that it's on that basis that they decide what kind of advance to offer. And they will come back to the agent and they will make an offer for the book. And at that stage, what I really dislike as an agent is if they say, we really want to acquire this book and the advance level will be this, but they don't include all the royalty information, because there are so many different royalty rates and so many different markets, and you need to know. But it's also absolutely brilliant when you get that offer. And there is nothing as good as ringing a debut author and saying, you've got a new book. It's brilliant. It's just fantastic. You know, it's one of the absolute pleasures of the job. And then generally speaking, there's quite a bit of negotiation backstage of the proceedings, just to kind of pin down the commercial aspects of the deal, I suppose. And then once the contract is agreed, or actually this probably shouldn't really happen, but simultaneously with the contract negotiation happening, the editor who's acquired the text will have got in contact with the author, obviously, and been very excited about being able to acquire the book, and then they'll get down to the nitty-gritty of working on it. And that's what I was saying, always an editor wants to edit the book as well. And actually it's at this point that one of the key kind of relationships are set in concrete, and that's the kind of communication between the editor and the author. And it took me quite a long time to realize when I started as an agent that a lot of authors at that stage kind of think whatever the editor says they have to do. Actually that's not the case at all. The best editor, it's your book, it's always the author's book, and the agent and the editor are just trying to help them bring the best out. But as an author, if you disagree with that, then it's the normal thing to say that and to have a discussion about it. And again, that's where an agent can be really important, because for an editor who's just got their publishing deal and is overwhelmed and feels very fish out of water, they don't know what the protocol is. If they get editorial notes that they think, hang on a minute, they want me to kill off this character and I don't want to, you can talk to the agent about it. And I'm very happy to either talk you through how to go back to the editor, or to ring the editor, or we'll go get on a call together, or whatever is easiest for the author, you know, how to sort that out. So the book will go through some editing processing in-house, and then at the same time as that, the editor will also be briefing a cover, so talking to the arts, the design team. And I have worked in lots of publishing houses where design didn't necessarily read the full manuscript, so the editor really had to sort of say, this is what we're looking for, this is the feel, and then the designer will come up with probably 10 or 20 different approaches for this particular book, and they will all be discussed. The author will be kept out of this totally. This will all happen internally at this stage to try and narrow down an approach. And then what will happen is, what should happen, it doesn't always happen, and again, an agent can blow her top of this, they will send at a very early stage, once they've kind of agreed an approach in-house, they will send that approach to the author, to the author's input. And it used to be in contracts that the author had approval of covers. That hasn't been in contracts for ages. They now have right of consultation for covers, because sometimes you had an impasse where publishers really believed it should go this way and authors believe the book cover should be something else. But again, the agent can help navigate all of that. And by and large, again, the publishers are protecting their investment. They have a certain vision for the book and a certain market, but they want to make the author happy. It's very, 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 very rare, and it's bad form in my view for a publisher just to kind of steamroll ahead with a cover that they know an author doesn't like, but it really doesn't happen. There can be quite heated debate, but ultimately they try and reach a point where everybody is very happy.
Okay.
And the cover is generally ready 9 months ahead of publication in the UK, because the publishers are selling into Waterstones and they're selling into the independent bookshops 9 months ahead of publication. And it's much easier to say, we have this fantastic book coming out and here's a great cover, than to say we have a fantastic book coming out and we don't really have a cover yet. You know, So that's the ideal. And whilst that's going back and forth, the book is still being edited, and very, very briefly, the editor has done an in-depth edit on it. And when everybody, the editor and the author, are happy with that, the book goes for copy editing. And copy editing is where the book is put into house style. So each publishing house will have, they'll use ISED endings or IZED endings that's put into house style. They'll have a certain way they put their chapter openers.
So we're talking basically European English or American English. And,
exactly.
But even that'd be other subtle things, I'm sure, in terms of layout on the page and all that kind of thing that matches the book.
Well, the copy edit stage, they haven't designed the text yet, but it's also that thing where a fresh pair of eyes comes and copy it. The editor doesn't copy edit the text, it goes out to somebody else. So it's a completely fresh pair of eyes. And the copy editor is also not just doing the house style and making things consistent. They will pick up something that doesn't quite make sense, or a loose end that an editor has missed or an author has missed, or actually amazingly often the heroine of the book having blue eyes in chapter 1 and green eyes in chapter 20. So they will pick up that kind of thing as well.
Okay, yeah.
And once all the copy editing list is agreed, the book is then sent for setting as a page proof, which is exactly, I wish I had some visuals to show, but that's exactly when the text is designed. So if it's going to have illustrations, it's dropped into place with the gaps for the illustrations. The illustration brief is being done separately, or if it doesn't have text, it doesn't have illustrations, it's just designed to run to a certain page extent and all of that kind of thing. And the editor, the author is under contract, is sent one set of page proofs for checking, but most authors like to read their page proofs. And again, for a debut author, it's so exciting because it's the first time your book looks like a proper book, the way it's set on the page. But it's not, the onus isn't on the author, or the responsibility isn't the author's to proofread the book. It is proofread again by somebody separately, who reads it again line by line against the copy edited text to make sure everything's correct. And generally speaking, you're not encouraged to make changes to your book at proof page stage because it costs an awful lot of money. So again, in contracts, it's generally agreed that if you make changes that amount to more than 10% of the book, you've got to change, or the publisher will pay for 10% of changes, but you've got to pay for anything above that.
Okay.
And in-house, more than one set of page proofs is checked. So all the corrections are made to one set of page proofs, and then they check that against a second set of page proofs, but the author won't be sent, the author will only see the one set. And the next thing the author will get is the finished copy of the book, which is really brilliant.
There you go. Yeah. It's I always knew it was complicated, don't get me wrong, but it boggles the mind how many people are behind each individual book. And even like that, I mean, authors are always giving out about how slow the traditional publishing process is, but that's because it seems like it has so many people involved, and each person needs to take their time with the manuscript. So no wonder it's as slow as it is.
To be honest, it's a really interesting thing. It's anyone who is involved in publishing, when you get your deal, you will find things move at an absolutely glacial pace, and then they rush, and then they move to glacial pace again. But you could actually get from manuscript to printed book but finished manuscript, you would not the editing as well, but to finished book in 2 weeks. But the big thing is the sell into the bookshops is 9 months ahead, and the publishers have to have a cover before they start trying to sell in. So that's one of the things that makes it seem very slow as well. But also, this isn't the ideal way of doing things, but I signed a deal or agreed a deal for an author in February, I think. And that contract, I'm still negotiating that contract with the publishing house.
Wow.
And it's the absolute nitty gritty. We're down to 2 final clauses on it, but it's just like, I always fear this, who's going to just give up the will to live first. And in this case, actually, the author has carried on working with the editor on the book. The book itself is way further ahead in the process than the contract is. And I never normally would allow that to happen, but just because of when they want to publish, and because the editor and the author have worked together previously, I know nothing's going to be disastrous, but things move at a glacial pace.
Polly, that has been illuminating and eye-opening and all the other positive things about making things clear, but at the same time it's so complicated that we could never discuss it enough, really. Like I'm sure there's so many steps within steps there of what you just said as well.
I didn't even mention publicity or marketing or anything.
Exactly. Yeah.
Just what happens to the
and
paper.
That's a whole other thing, like advanced reader copies and everything. So Polly, thank you so much. I did have more questions planned, but you've kind of in a roundabout way asked them already, or answered them already, I should say. There was one question I really wanted to ask that I will ask as well, if that's okay. Because we did discuss it earlier. I had Sarah Webb on my own podcast before, and she famously said, I put her quote in the opening credits of the first season of my podcast, that the most common mistake people make when submitting things is submitting it too early. And you had said to me that was your one bit of advice. So what do you think how do you think an author knows that, no, this isn't too early, it is ready now? I mean, you mentioned earlier somebody submitting going, I know he asked for the first 5 pages, but the first 25 aren't very good. Like that's an obvious sign. But what is it that an author should look for in their own manuscript when they go, yes, this is actually ready to submit?
Well, the biggest piece of advice I can give you is when you've typed the end and when you've polished and scrubbed and you're absolutely convinced this is as good as it can be, I cannot improve this, is that you push it in a desk drawer for at least 6 weeks and don't look at it and don't think about it, forget it, and 6 weeks later. I actually think 6 months, but that's asking the impossible. Take it out and have a look at it, because you will be amazed at what leaps out and just hits you in the eye that you hadn't even seen when you were very, very close to it. So that would be my number one thing. I absolutely agree with Sarah Webb that people's biggest downfall is that they spend years working on their manuscript and they write the end and they want to get it out there and they send it out too early. So put it aside, please, please, please put it aside for as long as you can. I would also then advise people to get somebody else to read it and not get their husband or wife or child or mother or father, because those people support you and love you and only want you to do well. And it's very hard for them to say, actually, this isn't very good, or actually, I don't think that character works. I think, somebody like going to your local library and asking the librarian if they'd mind having a read of it, going to your local bookshop and asking if they'd, somebody who knows about books, knows about the market, and doesn't know you. I think people are really willing to help. I think if you're in a writer's group, ask somebody in the writer's group to critique it for you as well. I think the other thing that is quite a useful thing to do, again, it's time consuming and you need a bit of patience, is I would always advise people to submit to several agents at once, because it can take a while for an agent to get back. And if you do it on an agent by agent basis, it'll be 20 years before you've heard back from 10 agents. But I think there's a lot to be said for choosing maybe 6 agents and sending your manuscript to them, and seeing most agents, if they get back at all, will get back with a fairly pro forma thing. But some agents will, if they think there's something in the manuscript, will take a bit more time to respond. And if you get 6 agents coming back telling you something very similar, I think that's well worth listening to. I mean, you'll get 6 agents telling you something totally different, and that's when you have to remember the book is yours and you hold on to the heart of that. But if 6 people say, I really like this book, but I don't think you say it's middle grade and I think it's YA, that's a really key thing to listen to. That's a helpful thing as well. But my biggest thing of all is get someone to read it who doesn't love you and support you, and put it in a drawer. When you've got it as good as you possibly can, as you think you can get it, push it away for 6 weeks and then take it out and have a read, and that will be a revelation.
Brilliant. Polly, Nolan, thank you so much for coming on to WonderPod and opening a lot of our eyes regards kind of agents and publishers and how that all works. And it's been great having you on.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and best of luck to everybody. Don't forget, we're all looking for stories, so keep at it.
Excellent. Thanks once again to Polly for taking some time out of her, as you heard, very busy schedule. If you would like to get in touch with Polly, you will find her website, email and more in the show notes. Or you can just Google PaperCuts Limited or Polly Nolan and she should show up. I think my one takeaway from my chat with Polly is just how in-depth and absolutely layered the entire publishing industry is. So if you are lucky enough to be published by a good quality publisher, it means there is a team of professionals there who are trying to help your book do as well as it can. If you haven't already, be sure to check out my interview with Matthew Parkinson from Little Island Books. Matthew and I had a chat about publishing, and I really think if you enjoyed this episode, you will definitely get something out of our other bonus episode this week. Once you've listened to those 2 episodes, however, I'd love you to go over to Instagram, where you'll find our Instagram account at WonderFest IRE, so for Ireland, so at WonderFest IRE. There's loads of book recommendations, letting you know about different events coming up for WonderFest, and now we're going to be starting to do occasional Instagram live chats, and you'll get a chance to even throw in a question or two to whoever happens to be on, so do check it out. It's well worth the look. Here on the podcast, however, next week I'll be chatting to debut authors Rob Grant and Katrina Sweeney. We'll be talking about how they came to be first-time children's authors, what it was like debuting during a pandemic, and much more. But until then, I'll see you all next week. Thanks for listening. I hope you found this as useful, as inspiring as I did. Don't forget that WonderFest is happening from the 17th to the 21st of November 2021. Head over to wonderfest.ie to find out how else you can have a whale of a time. See you there!